The morning of Queen Elizabeth II's funeral dawned gray and solemn over London. Thousands of people lined the streets, their faces etched with grief and respect. Among the sea of black clothing and tear-stained cheeks, the red uniforms of the Queen's Guard stood out like beacons of tradition and duty. Sergeant James Mitchell had been part of the Queen's Guard for 12 years. At 34, he had stood watch at countless ceremonies, parades, and state functions. His record was spotless, his dedication unwavering. Today, however, felt different. Today, he would be saying goodbye to the woman who had been the symbol of his nation for over 70 years, as he adjusted his iconic sours, bearskin hat, and checked his rifle one final time. James thought about his grandmother, Eleanor. She had been 93 when she passed away, just 2 weeks before the Queen's death. Eleanor had lived through World War II, had seen the Queen's coronation on their first television set, and had always spoken of Her Majesty with deep admiration and love. The procession route was packed with mourners. From every corner of the Commonwealth, children sat on their fathers' shoulders. Elderly veterans clutched their medals. People of all backgrounds stood united in their shared loss. The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone present. But perhaps none felt it more acutely than the guards who would escort their beloved monarch on her final journey. James took his position along the route, his face stern and professional beneath the shadow of his hat. The training kicked in automatically, shoulders back, eyes forward, breathing steady. He had done this countless times before, but never had the silence been so profound. Never had the air felt so thick with emotion. As the distant sound of military bands began to echo through the streets, James felt his heart beating faster. Soon, the Queen's coffin would pass by, draped in the royal standard and crowned with the imperial state crown. He would stand perfectly still, as tradition demanded, as duty required. But sometimes duty and humanity collide in ways no training can prepare you for. The funeral procession began to approach James's section of the route. The clip-clop of horses' hooves on the pavement created a rhythmic soundtrack to history in the making. The gun carriage of the King's Troop Royal Horse Artillery came into view, bearing the Queen's coffin with solemn dignity. Behind the coffin walked King Charles III, his face a mask of composed grief. The new monarch was flanked by his siblings and followed by other members of the royal family. Their measured steps echoed the heartbeat of a nation in mourning. James had seen the royal family many times before, but never in circumstances so raw and vulnerable as the procession drew nearer. James noticed something that made his professional composure waver for just a moment. In the crowd directly across from his position, he spotted a familiar figure. Mrs. Dorothy Henley, his grandmother's best friend and neighbor, was there. At 87 years old, Dorothy had made the journey to London despite her frail health and limited mobility. Dorothy was in a wheelchair, pushed by what appeared to be her grandson. But what caught James's attention wasn't just her presence, it was her struggle. The crowd was dense, and people naturally pressed forward to get a better view. Dorothy's wheelchair was being pushed back further and further from the barriers. Her grandson looked frustrated and helpless, as taller people blocked their view entirely. James watched as Dorothy lifted her hand to shield her eyes from the morning sun, straining to catch even a glimpse of the Queen's coffin. She had told James's grandmother countless times about her deep respect for Her Majesty. Dorothy had written the Queen a letter every Christmas for 40 years, and had received a reply from Buckingham Palace twice, treasured moments she spoke of with pride until her dying. The irony wasn't lost on James. Here was a woman who had devoted decades of her life to honoring the Queen, who had traveled hundreds of miles despite her age and physical limitations, and she couldn't see the farewell she had come to witness. Meanwhile, James stood in perfect position, bound by duty to remain motionless and silent, watching it all unfold. The funeral procession was now less than 50 meters away. James could see the flowers on the coffin, could hear the muffled sobs of onlookers. His training screamed at him to maintain position, to honor the centuries of tradition that demanded his absolute stillness. But his heart was pulling him in a different direction entirely. The moment of decision arrived faster than James had anticipated. The Queen's coffin was now directly in front of his position. The morning sunlight, catching the precious gems in imperial state crown. The silence was absolute except for the sound of horses and the distant weeping of mourners. James felt something break inside him, not his discipline, not his training, but something deeper. It was the same feeling he had experienced when his grandmother passed away. The realization that some moments in life transcend rules and regulations. This was bigger than military protocol. This was about human dignity, respect, and the very values the Queen herself had embodied throughout her remarkable reign. Without warning, James took a step forward, then another. The movement was so unexpected, so unprecedented, that nearby spectators didn't immediately understand what was happening. A Queen's Guard never breaks formation during a ceremony, especially not during something as monumentally important as the monarch's funeral. James walked directly toward Dorothy's wheelchair, his heavy military boots echoing against the pavement. The crowd parted instinctively, confused but sensing the gravity of whatever was unfolding. Dorothy looked up at him with wide, startled eyes as this tall figure in the iconic red uniform approached her. "Ma'am," James said quietly, his voice barely audible above the sound of the procession. "Would you like to see the Queen properly?" Before Dorothy could respond, before her grandson could object, before anyone could fully process what was happening, James gently took hold of the wheelchair handles. With remarkable care and precision, he began to maneuver Dorothy through the crowd toward the front barrier. People stepped aside without question. There was something in James's bearing, something in the respectful urgency of his actions, that commanded instant cooperation. Even in breaking protocol, he carried himself with the dignity and purpose that had made him an exemplary guard for over a decade. The other guards in James's unit noticed the movement immediately. Their training told them to maintain position, but their eyes followed their colleague with a mixture of concern and understanding. They could see what James saw, an elderly woman who deserved better, who deserved to witness history just as much as anyone else present. James positioned Dorothy's wheelchair directly at the barrier, giving her an unobstructed view of the Queen's coffin as it passed by. The tears that had been building in Dorothy's eyes finally spilled over as she raised her hand in a trembling salute to her beloved monarch. What happened next surprised everyone, including James himself. As Dorothy raised her shaking hand in salute, something remarkable began to ripple through the crowd around them. People who had been jostling for better positions suddenly stepped back, creating more space. Others began helping elderly spectators move closer to the barriers. The moment became contagious. A young man lifted his small daughter onto his shoulders so she could see over the crowd. A group of teenagers helped an elderly veteran in a military wheelchair get a better view. The simple act of compassion that James had initiated was spreading like wildfire through the gathered mourners. Even more surprising was the reaction from James's fellow guards. Instead of maintaining rigid formation, they began subtly adjusting their positions to help other struggling spectators. One guard discreetly moved aside to allow a family with young children to see better. Another caught the eye of an elderly man who was clearly struggling to stand and gave him an almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. The funeral procession continued its solemn march, but something had fundamentally changed in the atmosphere. What had started as a formal, rigid ceremony was transforming into something more human, more connected. The grief was still profound, but it was now shared in a way that felt more genuine and inclusive. James remained beside Dorothy as the royal family passed by. King Charles III, walking behind his mother's coffin, seemed to notice the small commotion. For just a brief moment, his eyes met James's across the crowd. Instead of the disapproval that James might have expected, he saw something else entirely understanding. Perhaps even gratitude. Dorothy whispered something that only James could hear. She would have wanted this, you know. She always cared about the ordinary people. Her voice was weak, but filled with conviction. 40 years I wrote to her, and she always wrote back about service to others. This is service, young man. This is what she taught us. The words hit James harder than any reprimand could have. He realized that in breaking protocol, he hadn't dishonored the Queen's memory. He had embodied the very principles she had spent her life promoting. Service above self. Compassion over convention. Humanity over hierarchy. As the last of the funeral procession passed their position, James remained with Dorothy. The crowd began to slowly disperse, but many people stopped to speak with the elderly woman, sharing their own memories of the Queen and expressing their gratitude for what they had witnessed. The immediate aftermath of James's actions was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions and uncertain consequences. As the funeral procession disappeared around the corner toward Westminster Abbey, reality began to set in. James had broken one of the most fundamental rules of military ceremony during the most watched event in recent British history. His commanding officer, Colonel William Harrison, approached with measured steps. James straightened his shoulders and prepared for the inevitable confrontation. He had no regrets about what he had done, but he understood the military system well enough to know that consequences were coming. "Sergeant Mitchell," Colonel Harrison said quietly, his voice betraying no emotion. "Report to my office immediately following the ceremony." His tone was professional, but James caught something unexpected in his eyes, not anger, but something closer to conflicted respect, as James helped Dorothy back to her grandson and prepared to return to his duties. Something extraordinary began to happen around him. Members of the public started approaching not to complain about the disruption, but to thank him. An elderly man with military medals pinned to his jacket shook James's hand firmly. "That was real service," stunned, he said, with tears in his eyes. A young mother with 2 small children stopped to speak with him. "My children will remember this forever," she said. "They'll remember that sometimes doing the right thing is more important than following rules." Thank you for showing them that. Even more surprising were the reactions from other members of the Queen's Guard and military personnel present. While maintaining their professional demeanor, several gave James subtle nods of approval. One sergeant whispered as he passed, "Well done, mate." She would have been proud. The media coverage that followed was immediate and intense. Videos of James's actions, captured by dozens of smartphones, began circulating on social media within minutes. News. Organizations scrambled to identify the guard who had broken protocol to help an elderly woman see the Queen's funeral. Dorothy Henley, meanwhile, became an overnight sensation herself. Reporters discovered that she was indeed a devoted royalist who had corresponded with the Queen for decades. Her story, and James's compassionate response to her situation, struck a chord with people around the world who were already emotional from the day's events by evening. #Royal Guard Compassion was trending globally on social media. People shared stories of times when following their hearts had been more important than following rules. The incident had become a symbol of the very values the Queen had represented throughout her reign. The meeting with Colonel Harrison was nothing like James had expected. As he entered the office that afternoon, still in his ceremonial uniform, he prepared for a career-ending conversation. Instead, he found his commanding officer reviewing a stack of letters and printouts that had already arrived at the barracks. "Sergeant Mitchell," Colonel Harrison began, gesturing to the papers on his desk, "I've been in the military for 32 years, and I've never seen anything quite like this." He held up several letters. "These are from members of Parliament, retired generals, and even a personal note from Buckingham Palace itself." James felt his heart skip a beat. A note from Buckingham Palace could only mean one thing: his actions had been noticed at the highest levels of the monarchy. He waited for Colonel Harrison to continue, unsure whether to feel relieved or terrified. The palace's message was brief. The colonel continued, but clear. It stated that your actions today exemplified the values of service and compassion that Her late Majesty held dear throughout her reign. They specifically noted that showing kindness to an elderly subject during her time of grief was exactly the kind of service the Queen would have appreciated. The relief James felt was overwhelming. But Colonel Harrison wasn't finished. "However," he continued, his tone becoming more serious, "we cannot ignore the fact that you broke protocol during one of the most important ceremonies in our nation's history. While your intentions were admirable, military discipline exists for important reasons." James nodded, understanding completely. "I accept full responsibility, sir. I knew the rules when I broke them. Which is precisely why," Colonel Harrison said with a slight smile, "your actions meant so much to everyone who witnessed them. You didn't break formation impulsively or carelessly. You made a conscious choice to put human compassion above military protocol, fully aware of the potential consequences. In the weeks that followed, James's story continued to resonate far beyond military circles. Dorothy Henley, who had returned to her small village, found herself inundated with letters from well-wishers around the world. She established a small charity in the Queen's memory, focused on helping elderly people attend important events and ceremonies. James was not punished for his actions. Instead, he was quietly commended for demonstrating the very qualities the military sought to instill in its members' judgment: compassion and moral courage. He remained with the Queen's Guard, but his perspective on duty had evolved. He understood now that true service sometimes meant having the courage to do what was right, even when it conflicted with what was expected. Years later, when James would tell the story to his own children, he would always end with the same thought: sometimes the most important rules are the ones written in your heart, not in any manual. Your great-great-grandmother, the Queen, understood that better than anyone.